Buzz.
All right, there we go. So welcome everybody to the Overwintering Honeybees in Alaska class. My name is Tim Hockman. I'm being helped tonight by Matt Moore. I started keeping bees in 2018, and I kind of have been obsessed with getting bees through the winter since the beginning. I'm a member of the Midnight Sun Bee Club. I strongly encourage everybody, if you're not a member of one of the local bee clubs, to join. There's two. The other one is the SABA, the South Central Alaska Beekeeping Association. There's a lot of experienced beekeepers, a lot of things to share in those clubs, and we have a shortage of mentors, but there are people that will help you out on those Facebook groups. I also started a YouTube page back in January because doesn't it make sense to start a Beekeeping in Alaska YouTube channel in January? It's been really fun, and I'm doing these presentations for free. But if you haven't subscribed to my channel, think about doing it. I'm going to try to keep putting up content that I think will help local beekeepers, and it's a bit of a balance to all of the YouTube videos that we see from people in Texas and Louisiana and Florida and Tennessee, and those guys are great, but it's different here. Our dynamics are different, and while a lot of those methods are the same, some of them are different enough that they'll kill your bees up here, or at least set them back seriously. So I want to start with a disclaimer. I do not have all the answers. I really can't say that enough. There are people that have kept bees in Alaska for decades, and they know more about beekeeping in the summertime than I will ever know. Something I don't understand is why many of these same beekeepers are not trying to keep their bees through the winter, or are trying only on a limited basis. I've had excellent overwintering success, and it's getting better. It's not because I have some magic secret sauce. I had good mentors to start with. I've been curious. I've done a lot of research, and I've just really been dedicated to try to establish a self-sustaining beekeeping community here. What I mean by that is flipping the paradigm to where everybody is trying to, and mostly getting their bees through the winter up here, making our own queens. I want to break our dependence on the California package industry. Now, I'm not saying anything bad about them. They're trying to make a living. But if you think about how bad the weather was down there this year, and what terrible shape the bees were in when they came, we can be independent of that. I haven't bought a package in 3 years. And I'm just here to tell you that you can be sustainable up here. You can make your own queens. You can get your bees through the winter, and you're not subject to whatever kinds of climate catastrophes California is going to have next spring. My methods are a work in progress. What I mean to say is I'm not selling the recipe. This is not the way to do things. And I change what I do every year based on new research and the successes of others. I love copying things that other people do that work, and my own observations. You know, if I see something that ought to work and it doesn't work out that way, then I'm going to try to figure out why, and figure out if my assumptions or my observations resolve that conflict. I overwinter outside. Overwintering inside is a thing. It's an effective thing when it happens in a climate-controlled building, and there are good results. I can tell you that my results outside are better than the people I talk to who overwinter inside. Now, I don't know why that is, and I know that there are many large beekeeping operations across the country that utilize indoor facilities. They they manage temperature and humidity, and they have good results. They have good overwintering results. But I haven't talked to anybody who consistently can replicate that in the facilities here. But I'm not saying anything bad about them. I think they're especially good if all you have is woodware, if all you've got is wooden boxes, because if you're going to do temperature controlled environment, you're putting your bees. If your bees have to overwinter in 38 degrees, it's a lot easier on them than if they have to overwinter at 10 below or 0. They'll do better. Finally, I don't want to argue with people that do things differently. If they're doing something that's working, I want to copy them. I want to learn from them. I want to see how it works, and I want to see if it works in my operation. So, again, I'm not trying to be the be all end all of beekeeping. I'm not into that. I don't care. What I'm into is flipping the paradigm so that people realize you can get your bees through the winter. It's not that hard. It's kind of formulaic, really. It's very basic. I'm interested. I know when that happens, then I just think all the community dynamics will change, and there'll be a lot more interaction. I think mentors will be more available. I just think everything will get better. It'll all be butterflies and unicorns and rainbows. Maybe not quite that, but it'll be so much better.
Hey, Tim, I'll jump in here.
Go ahead.
I've been keeping bees since 2017. I live on the east side of town. I live at an elevation. Things are a little bit more challenging here. The climate's a little bit rougher. And what I found right off the bat was I had problems with bears. The first year I had a colony that was decimated, and I didn't do what you should do, which is start off with 2. I started off with 1. That forced me to go out and start catching swarms, building up what I had so I could actually make it through the year and not be so discouraged that I couldn't do it. And in the process, what I found was there are a lot of people that are in northern climates that actually do this really well. And so my outlet was going to YouTube and finding people like Etienne Tardif, who's doing exactly what we're trying to do. And as soon as Tim saw it and he was telling me about it, I said, I'm looking at the same guy. We figured, we're not going to reinvent the wheel. And so really what we're trying to do is we're thinking about it more like beekeeping security. We want to be able to have queens that are up here that will make it through the winter with less problems. We want to get rid of that ball and chain if we can of getting bees from outside. I'll probably still get some. My success rate compared to Tim's, I'm right about 70% last year. And, we're still learning. And one of the things that shocked me is I give talks by myself. Gave one in the springtime to about 70 people. One guy was a beekeeper there, and he said, I fed my bees all the way through winter. I was like, what? He goes, yeah, in a wooden box. And he was feeding them every week, sugar syrup. And I was like, I still don't understand how he pulled that off. So the one thing to keep in mind is this isn't for a commercial operation. This is for small beekeepers. So more along, boutiques or just backyard beekeepers. But at the same time, we want to be successful, because if you're not successful, at some point in time, you'll say, I don't want to do this anymore. It's too hard. So our goal really is, more than anything else, is to be able to develop people that will also be mentors. So we'll have more bee stock up here. We'll have more people that get their bees through every winter, and they're more successful. And really, it's like, hey, it's no cost to you. It's just giving back to all the bee mentors that we've had along the way.
Very good. This is my history. I started in 2018. I had 2 colonies. I did a split. I went into winter with 3, and all 3 made it through winter. I was so excited the next April when I looked in, when I saw those bees. I was just so excited. I had followed the advice of my mentors. I followed their methods. And what I didn't know is my bees were already sick. I thought, this is so easy. I can't believe how easy this is. I expanded up to about 9 colonies the next year, shrunk down to 6 going into fall, and they just got so sick, and almost all were dead by November. A couple lingered into January. In 2021, I was 11 for 12. I don't know that I'll ever do that again. That was pretty cool. The difference was that I treated those packages with oxalic acid 7 days after the queen was released, which is before there was any captive brood. Those colonies were super healthy. In 21 to 22, that winter, I went in with 10, but I had noticed starting in July that my bees were just sick. One thing about keeping bees on a rooftop, and by the way, I'm the beekeeper for 49th State Brewing. I have bees on their warehouse, which is down in Ship Creek, which is not a great place for bees, but it's where they want their bees. And when you're keeping bees on a rooftop, you see every bee. They don't crawl up into the grass and disappear. And that rooftop was covered with crawling bees. And it was deformed wing virus and K-wing, paralytic bee. It was terrible. So I gave them all brood breaks, treated them with oxalic acid, and then I treated them with oxalic acid again in mid-October after all the winter brood emerged. And somehow, even though they were really sick, 6 of the 10 made it through. The next year, this was last winter, I got 12 of 14 through. One of them died in April. It was agonizingly close. So, and we did have a rough winter. So since I started, I got 71%. In the last 3 years, I'm 80%. And when I talk to my mentors, they talk about an average of about 70%, but it's a mix of overwintered bees and new colonies. And Nathan Bromley, one of my mentors, has never had a colony live more than 3 years. And I have 7 that have lived more than 3 years now. So it's not because I'm smart. It's not because I'm a genius. Mainly it's because I figured out a Varroa and what we can do about them in an Alaska context. And I'm using good overwintering techniques. So what I'd like to do is focus on what I've learned. These are lessons learned. Rather than a formula about how to do things, these are the keys. This is what I've learned I have to do to get it done. And then there are different ways to do these individual bullet points. There's a lot of variation, actually. But these are the 4 main things to getting bees through the winter. You need a healthy colony. And by healthy, I mean they are relatively virus-free and mite-free. And they have a strong population. You need adequate insulation. It's critical. People do get bees through winter in just wooden boxes up here, but it's very rare. And many times they get through in such weak condition, they can't do anything the next year. You need a good fall feeding strategy, and I'll talk more about that. And you need an emergency food, a winter feeding strategy. And we'll talk about that. So winter is our big issue, right? I mean, we're in Alaska. We have a very long winter. And in the summer, bees only live 6 to 8 weeks. Winter bees have to live 8 months in order to survive winter and to raise the next round of bees, next year's bees. So all of our winter bees emerge by mid-October. And my colonies started laying brood on April 1st this year. Now that's going to vary a little bit. You can ask me how I know that. I am not doing inspections. It's because I have temperature sensors in my colonies, and their cluster temperature is right around 70 degrees all winter long. And in a poly box, they heat the inside of that poly box to 70 degrees. I mean, you know, it's between 65 and 70, depending on where the sensor is and whether they're right underneath it. But they heat that whole box. And that means there's no brood. And on April 1st, and it was just April 1st this year, it's always right around there, if a few days, that temperature spikes to 90. And that lets me know, aha, now they're rearing brood. It says brood temperature. People argue about stuff like this all the time. Just think of it as the low 90s somewhere. And where you put the decimal, or whether it's 2 or 3, it's irrelevant. It's the low 90s. And so the main key for getting bees through the winter here is a sufficient population of healthy winter bees. I believe the number one reason colonies don't survive up here is Varroa. Now, that might not be entirely accurate, because beekeeper error is a large reason bees die up here. They go in and they try to get them through in just wood. They put upper entrances on there. They put ventilated devices on top of the colony to absorb moisture. That's not a thing. I can talk more about that later, but essentially they, in the effort to make sure moisture isn't a problem, they vent all the warm air out. They do inspections too late, and the bees can't reseal everything. And so it's just make it really just not possible. They don't feed them enough in the fall, or they start feeding too late. So so there's a lot of beekeeping error that goes into it, especially from inexperienced people. But the main reason it kills bees when you've done everything else right is Varroa mites. Now, Varroa mites, if they were on a human, they would be about the size of a dinner plate. So they're big in relationship to the size of bees. They work themselves between the plates on a bee's abdomen and feed off of the bees' fat bodies. And in the process, they introduce viruses. Now, a bee's immune system is its gut. Usually viruses, before Varroa, viruses were introduced through ingestion, and the bee's gut biome dealt with them. This is introduced directly into the bee. It bypasses their immune system, and that's why it's so devastating to them. And when these, and it's a number of viruses, paralytic bee virus and deformed wing virus and K-wing. There's, I don't know, there must be a dozen at least viruses. The main thing they have in common is that they shorten the lives of bees. And so in the summer, bees don't live long enough to raise enough brood. If you have a Varroa mite problem in the summer, what you'll see is the queen will often lay up a frame really nicely, but by the time that brood is capped, there's holes everywhere. And it's because they didn't have enough, they just didn't have enough foragers bringing back enough resources to feed all those brood. And then in the winter, of course, we need our winter bees to last 8 months, and that's just not going to happen if they have a high virus load. They can't. So the shorter lifespan affects everything. One of the dynamics of our bee populations is that our bee population peaks in July. Even a sick colony can look relatively healthy in late June and early July. They could simply outproduce the mites. The mite population peaks in August. It lags about a month. And that's right when your bees, our bees, need to start raising winter bees. Right when we need them to be the healthiest is when the infestation is the highest. What you start seeing in the second or third week of July with a sick colony is you start seeing a lot of deformed wing virus. But there's people here who haven't ever seen that. It literally looks like their wings have shriveled. It almost looks like they never, they were crumpled and never expanded into a wing-like shape. You can see crawling bees, and that's a number of irises. You'll see really spotty capped brood patterns. And you'll find that they'll take sugar syrup when you start feeding them in the fall, and they never get around to capping it. They just don't get to it. And part of that is because the population is crashing right when you're starting to feed. And so those sick bees can haul sugar syrup there, but they just can't generate enough heat. It takes a lot of heat to be able to manipulate wax. And sometimes the colony's getting cold. They're doing a poor job of brood rearing. So all kinds of things are ganging up on them there. When I look at my colonies, when I look back on my colonies that died, my dead outs, and when they died, what I know now is that if they were sick and they couldn't raise winter bees, they die before Christmas. They don't even make it into serious winter. If they raise some winter bees, but they were sick, they just gradually decline. And you have a last few hundred that die sometime in February, usually. February. A handful of them might make it into March, but a lot of times you just have the last, 300 bees, are all the queens right in the middle of them, and they just couldn't make it. Now, those bees didn't freeze. There's just once the population drops below critical mass, they can't do any of the high functions in winter. They can't maintain enough heat. They can't manage the moisture. And they can't travel for food because they can't stay warm. So they're doomed when this happens. Yeah, man.
One of the things that we always think about when we have something like a mite that's introduced to a colony is it's a one-way vector. That's not true with varroa mites. You could have varroa mites that don't have any viruses at all, but they can put the bite on a bee that does have a virus, then pass it on to another bee and to another bee. So it's something that it can just cascade very quickly through your colony. And so all these things that Tim is saying about seeing, what looks like a fantastic colony, and then have it just absolutely crash, it's a real thing.
It's impressive how fast they crash. So bees engage in a behavior called, I hope I say it right, trophallaxis, which is passing food mouth to mouth. And they're also passing viruses when they do that. And so you might only have a mite infestation of 10%, but you might have 80% of your bees that were exposed to the viruses that 10% had because of that particular behavior, the trophallaxis. I did get a question about how I know what month they die if the hive is closed up for winter. That's an excellent question. And by the way, you guys should ask questions. If I say something that doesn't sound right, or that sounds like, how the heck could he know that? You need to ask. And the answer is I have temperature sensors in my colony. Just like I know when they start laying brood, I know when they stop laying brood. I know when they're dying, because that temperature in that hive should stay right around 70. Now, depending on where the temperature sensor is placed, it might be 60, but it's fine if it's 60, because that means there's a good heat source going. And so what will happen is with a colony that's failing, that internal temperature just begins an irreversible slide down. And it's not sliding downward as much as it's sliding towards the external temperature. And when you get down to where it's maybe 2 or 3 degrees warmer than the external temperature, I know they're going to die. I know that. I open them up, they're going to die. And what I find is 200 live bees, 200 of them. And usually I just shake them out at that point. There's no way they can survive. It's not viable. And they freeze right away. It's a humane way to do it. But the reason I do it is because if I let those bees die in the hive, then they molder. The frames get all moldy, and the bees turn into this gross bee gack stuff that's really hard to clean up. And so I can go out there in February, I can pick a nice day, you know, in the mid-20s or something. I can go out there, I can brush the bees off gently because I don't want to damage the comb. And I can take that gear in and dry it out so that it's ready to go in the spring. So it's really valuable to know the temperature sensors are great for that. And because I've had colonies die at different times, and I can go in and look at them when I know they're doomed. I don't go in to see how they're doing, if they're doing okay, but I go in when I know they're doomed, because there's no way that a colony that's only 2 degrees warmer than the outside is going to survive. That tells me that there are just not enough bees to keep it warm. So that's Varroa. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Population and space, matching the population and space is very important. So you often hear people talk about how many boxes they should overwinter in. And people love to say, oh, 2 deeps, you have to have 2 deeps, you know, or they say 1 deep and 1 medium filled with food over their heads. Those are wrong answers. You know, I might be stepping on some toes, but those are wrong answers, because you can't say how many boxes you should overwinter in unless you know the population that you're dealing with. Bees do well when they're crowded and terrible when they have too much space. So, I'll hit on this topic again and again, but you need to think about your bee population and you need to make them tight before winter. Look at this dynamic. Now, this is a great Randy Oliver graph, and we're going to go over this quickly, but the point of this is that, and also it was from, you know, Manitoba. So, and they were shed wintered, which we're not really talking about, but the point here, the colony dynamics are about the same. The colony population peaks in early July. Even a healthy colony drops from 50,000 to under 20,000 in the next 3 months. Once you get past early July, the population is naturally decreasing. So you can't look at your giant booming colony in July and go, man, they're going to need 2 or maybe 3 deeps to get through winter. It will not be the same. It will not, it'll be less than 50% of that. In a healthy colony, in a sick colony, it'll be less than that. So the main reason I'm putting this on is to show that the population is going to drop. Now, I will talk more about this just a little bit, which is those colors that are bluish there, those represent winter bees and the age of winter bees. And his winter bees, and there's 2 important things to look at. There's a spring buildup, which is all those really old winter bees that are the last function in their life is to raise up the next year's bees, because the queen does not lay all winter. I guess I want to say that real quickly. A lot of the beekeeping stuff on YouTube and the books say that queens lay a little bit all winter. No, they don't. If they did, I'd see it on my temperature sensors. They don't lay all winter long. They start in April. So the winter bees in this, the longest ones, the longest lived winter bees are about 252 days, which is remarkable for bees that for a critter that only lives 6 to 8 weeks during the summer. But yeah, so think about when you look at space this time of year, look at it and anticipate that it's going to drop precipitously. So every fall I condense, and now is fall. Every fall I condense. And what I do is I try to make sure I assess the population. I look in there, and if I don't have enough bees to fill the box, I either reduce the number of boxes I have or reduce the number of frames in the box. And by that, I mean, I shrink the size of the box. I will pull a frame and I will put in a follower board. A follower board is just a piece of wood or foam that's the same dimensions as a frame. and it takes up space, but that space that it takes up, the bees do not have to heat it. So, so which frames do you remove? That's the question I get. And the answer is anything that's not drawn comes out. Bees, the way bees stay warm in the winter is they put their heads into a cell, and then the other bees cluster around them and they vibrate their flight muscles to create friction, which creates heat, which keeps them warm. They cannot do that on a frame with undrawn comb. On an undrawn frame. I don't think you can have undrawn comb without comb. And so if you look at your box and look at it from the bottom, you can tell, because a lot of them are drawn the top couple inches. But if you look from the bottom and you see that you have frames that are say less than 60% drawn for sure, those need to be gone. You need to take them out, and you don't want to, and odds are, and this is only if you, this is once you know you have a population you need to reduce, but if you have undrawn frames down there, you'll need to reduce. So you want to get rid of those frames. If you have drone, I use drone comb specifically because that lets, or drone foundation, that means that my colonies put drones on the frames that I want them to put them on there. And there's all kinds of benefits for that. They drop, my bees put almost no burr comb between the boxes. So when I pry a box up, they don't have all the frames glued to each other because they're not building drone comb there, because I give them space to build drone combs in other spots. But also when I have to condense them, drone comb, they do not need drone comb in the winter. So the drone comb can always, the drone frames can always come out. So it makes that easy. If you do have a frame that has a lot of drone cells on it, those big cells, not the worker brood cells, but the big cells, those need to get moved to the outside. It's the bees have a harder time creating heat because the dynamics are different in that giant cell. It's almost big enough for 2 worker bees to crawl in there. So you want to move those to the outside. So now, why are we doing this? Why do we want to condense? So the main thing is, I should probably have this slide before that. The main thing is that you want them to be able to efficiently manage temperature and humidity. Think about the colony in your hive like your house or a house with a furnace. Most furnaces can heat an unheated, most furnaces can heat an uninsulated hive, but they'll heat more efficiently if it's an insulated hive. And also the size of the heater, and this is really the important part of this, the size of the heater changes depending on how big your house is. And so you want to match the size of your heater. Well, it's reverse. You want to match the size of your, in this case, the heater are your bees, your colony. You want to match the size of the house to the size of the heater. That's really what we're doing by condensing. So if you give them extra space, like if you're under the misunderstanding that you have to add your super back so they can fill it up with sugar syrup, you're adding extra space for them to heat. That makes them work harder in the winter. And there's a term called metabolic fatigue, which talks about when bees have to spend so much effort and energy heating the colony all winter that there's some mortality just due to metabolic fatigue. If you insulate it well and make them tight, give them the small insulated space to keep warm, they do that better. They burn less fuel, and they don't experience that metabolic fatigue. So that's what you're doing. You're making it easier for them to manage heat and humidity. Does anybody have any questions? So some at this point, this is where I really start deviating from what gets taught in the lower 48, because you don't see a lot of condensing down there. You don't, and you do have people that put extra boxes of food on top, and it's just wrong. It's just wrong. It's making it harder for them. So a question is, should we use foam insulation board for follower boards? And the answer is absolutely. But, and this is important, cover it with packing tape or else they'll just chew it up. They chew right through that foam insulation. So just put a layer of packing tape around the outside. They won't chew through it. The other thing is when on my follower boards, and I do make them out of 1-inch foam boards, it's just so easy to do. And I make them not the dimensions of a frame, but the dimensions of the box, so that when I slide that follower board in, it fits snug against the sides. It won't slide up and down or just drop down. It's kind of form fit. You have to squeeze it in there a little bit. You don't want to force it, but you want it to essentially have a little bit of friction on the sides so that it stays there. You don't want bee space above it. You don't want bee space beside it. You want that, you're essentially changing the dimensions of your hive wall from 1 inch or 1.5 inches to another inch, so 2.5 inches. You're adding another inch of insulation as a sidewall. That's what you're doing. You're shrinking the size of your box. So don't think about bee space above or beside. You want that to fit in there as an extension of the wall. Any other questions about space and condensing? Okay, I will say this too, that bees are great at managing crowded conditions. They are not good at managing too much space. They are not good. How to condense again. So I think, do I have another? Yeah. All right. So I've been doing a bunch of trainings on this, and sometimes I forget which one I've been doing. Okay. So the first thing you want to do is assess the size of your population. You want to know how many frames of bees you have. And the way you do that is not by looking in from above, because bees tend to always be filling those top gaps. You want to tilt that box back and look from the bottom, because what you want, a frame of bees, when you're counting it this way, is from the top to the bottom and side to side. So if you tilt that box back and you see every gap of every frame filled with bees from side to side, you have 10 frames of bees. That's a box of bees. That is a good thing. Okay. If you look from the bottom and you only have 6, and it won't always be 6, like maybe they'll be spread over 8, but they'll be centered, so there are gaps on both sides. So you're just guessing 6-ish. Let's say you have 6 frames of bees. Then you need to take a frame or 2 out of there. You need to shrink that space, because you don't want to put 6 frames of bees in a 10-frame box going into winter. That 6 frame of bees is going to turn into 4 frames in another month and a half. You know, 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, your queen was laying 1,500 or 2,000 eggs a day. You are losing 1,500 to 2,000 bees a day now. That's the opposite end of that dynamic. So figure out your population. Now, if you have 1 box and you have 10 frames of bees, you're in perfect situation. If you have 1 box and 7 frames of bees, I would take the 2 outside frames out and put in a follower board. So essentially that's what you're doing. If you have 2 boxes and you have, say, 16 frames of bees, add some follower boards in both boxes. If you have 2 boxes and 14 frames of bees, I would shake them all into 1 box. I'd go into winter with 1 box. I condense them, you know. So it's not an exact science. It's not a perfect formula. But the closer you get to 10 frames, the more likely you should be in 1 box. So, and at this time of year, really, your queen should be, well, yes. So, yeah, Tawny, we don't want to, well, I guess before I talk about forcing the queen down, because that's the kind of thing people usually do in late June or July, because they're trying to keep the queen, okay, they're trying to keep the queen laying down below and the honey going above. So go ahead, Matt. You're seeing something here.
Yeah, so one of the things I would say is, and correct me if you think I'm wrong here, Tim, I think about it like this, is I want to get a box pretty much 100% full of bees if I can. And so
Mhm.
that's really what my goal is. And I think what Tim is saying is if you've got another box that's on top, that's when you're actually going to be fine tuning that volume. So you'll reduce that volume. So you've got that space that's remaining full of bees as well. And I try to do it more like a chimney. So I've got more bees below, forcing more heat up through a smaller area if there is a top box.
So
That's how.
you would put, if you had two 10-frame boxes
Mhm.
and you had, say, 16 frames of bees, where would you add follower boards?
I'd add them in the top.
To the
Absolutely.
top. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Because
But
as the
but they're
population,
going to be on the side, so it'll be a
yeah,
side of follower boards, side of follower boards, bees in the middle, all this heat coming up from the bottom, just boom, right to there.
yeah. And so what'll happen as they continue to shrink over the fall, because we're not going to get into our colonies again after about 2 weeks from now is the latest you should be in, and maybe just a week from now. We don't want to get back into our colonies. We want to leave them alone, get them set up. But as that colony shrinks, they'll be up there in that top box in the tightest spot, give them the best chance to stay warm. So Tawny, you're talking about we don't really want to force them down. We want to squeeze them in, if that makes sense. If we've got this much space, I don't know if I can make my, okay, if we got this much space and this many bees, we want to give them this much space. That's what I'm really trying to get at. So so if you have two boxes of bees, then you have to make a decision about whether you're going to shrink them all the way to one box. And I'm not, there was some misunderstanding when I did this first training. I am not advocating that you condense bees that don't need to be condensed. If you have two boxes and you have 20 frames of bees, you should not be condensing. You already have your population matched to the size. So I'm not saying you have to get down to one box. I'm saying that if you don't have two boxes full of bees, you need to manipulate the situation so that however big your boxes are, they're full of bees. So you can shrink them from 10 frames to 9 to 8 by adding follower boards, or you can shrink them down to 10. Like if you have 12 frames of bees, it's silly to go 6 over 6. Just shrink them into one big deep box. That's what to do. Now, okay, good. Now, Jeff is saying, why can't you tilt the box back to look under and see how many bees you have? That's what I'm saying to do. Exactly. But you need to do it for both boxes. Tilt it back and count your bees. If you only see 6 frames on the top box, set it aside, tilt the bottom one back. If you only see 6 frames, you have 12 frames of bees. You need to shrink them to one box. That's what you need to do. I guess you could go in and go 6 over 6 with a lot of follower boards, but I think that's overkill. And so when I talked before in that previous slide about which frames to keep, you want to give them the best frames for them to stay warm in. So you want to keep all the brood frames in, and you want to, if you have a partially drawn brood frame, you want to put it on the outside. It's the ones on the inside that help them stay warm. And if you have an undrawn frame that doesn't have brood on it, or a marginally drawn frame, you want to take it out. You do not want that in there. Oh, what if you can't tilt them? I see, I misunderstand. Why couldn't you tilt them? You want to unmute and
You mean like an apame where the bottom box is attached to the base?
huh. Yeah, I just don't understand, Jeff, why you can't tilt them. So, but I don't use Apames, so I guess that could be it. Oh, only one good arm.
There you go.
You need a buddy. You need to get a volunteer to come out and help you if you can. Now, there is another way to do it, which is you can pull a couple of you can pull a couple of frames and you can look down. And if you see lots of bees down that cylinder, like if you pull an outside frame and like if you pull frame number 10 or 1, whichever one it is, and you look on that next frame and it's got bees, then you can see all the way down from the top. And if that frame 9 or frame 2 have bees all the way down on the outside, you're in great shape. You got a box full of bees. But if you pull that outside frame and that second frame, frame 9 or 2, depending on how you're looking at it, only has bees on 2 inches of it, that's not a frame of bees. So that's probably what I would do. Okay. Okay. So all this yakking around, we're really just saying 2 things. You need to have a low varroamide infestation, and you need to have a population that fills the available space for the healthy colony requirements for making it through winter. Adequate insulation. Now, when I was learning to do this, I was taught that bees only heat the cluster, not the entire hive. James, I'll get to that. And I can tell you that is only true if you have your bees in wooden boxes. And even then, it's only true because an R value of less than 1 leaches that heat out of the colony so fast that they can't possibly heat the entire hive. You just can't do it. Polyhives have R values of around 7 or greater. And I can tell you, my temperature sensors let me know that they heat the whole hive. Etienne Tardif, who's got a north of 60 degrees YouTube channel, and he's an engineer. I'm not going to say anything bad about engineers, Matt, but he put 19 temperature sensors in one hive. And because he wanted to know where the temperature was throughout the entire hive all winter. And he keeps bees in the Yukon Territory, and their winters are worse than Fairbanks. It's not uncommon to get 6 weeks of 40 below, 6 consecutive weeks of 40 below at a time. And he gets his bees through the winter. And what his research sort of revolutionized what we think about for bees and winter behavior. So what we know, we're always taught that in the winter, the bees cluster tightly and they sort of lock legs and the hairs on their bodies intertwine, and they create this heat efficient cluster, and the inside of the cluster is 70 degrees and the outside is 40, and they slowly move around to consume food. Well, and the oxygen level goes down, and so it helps them go into a state of torpor. They don't really hibernate, but they go into a state of torpor in this low oxygen environment. All that's true, but here's what was wrong about it. That's their emergency survival technique. It's not their preferred survival technique. When you put them in a poly box, in an insulated box where all the heat they're generating from that cluster isn't immediately lost, they don't cluster tightly. They move all around. And they don't, contrary to what a lot of people say, they don't eat more food because they're active. It's the opposite. They eat less food because they're not trying to keep the hive warm constantly. Think about your furnace. If you have a furnace in an uninsulated house, it can keep it warm, but it goes through a lot of fuel. It's running on max the whole time. It's the same for your bees. They can keep it warm, although they do have this metabolic fatigue. At some point, they can succumb to it. But when you heat it, they don't go through nearly as much food. Etienne's bees in Yukon territories only go through 25 to 30 pounds of syrup in a winter. Now, down south, they talk about them eating 90 pounds of syrup sometimes in the winter, and that's down south. So when you let the bees stay warm, you just dramatically change that dynamic. And I talked about this. But I guess the one thing I didn't say is in a poorly insulated house, only the areas near the heat source are warm. And in extreme cold, even those areas are cold, even though the furnace is running continuously. That's an important way to think about your bees inside. And when it gets really, really, I can tell you my bees don't cluster until it's like below zero. I frequently see them, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I frequently see them crawling around outside of the hive anytime the temperature is above 20. Now, they're not crawling randomly all over. I mean, it's cold outside, but where the warm air is venting, where they're moving the air around, they crawl outside the hive in that airflow. 3, 4, 5, 6, sometimes 10 bees are in this little, they'll just be crawling in and out in that warm. So that lets you know, even though the external temperature is 20, it's much warmer on the inside, much warmer, even on the bottom of the hive where the openings are. So I'm a couple quick questions. I'm going to save Varroa for later. Poly hives, I buy mine from Regeneration Nutrition in Eagle River by Nathan Bromley. One of the things that I encourage people to do, if you want to get your bees through the winter, I highly recommend you buy your equipment from somebody who gets their bees through the winter. There are several people that sell bees that don't get bees, or excuse me, that sell equipment that don't successfully overwinter. You should not be going to them for advice. They may know a ton about bees, but if they don't have personal experience overwintering, you're not going to get the best. You're not going to get the best advice. The other thing is when you buy your equipment from somebody, you sort of establish a relationship. It's not exactly a mentor relationship, but it lets you ask questions and get the right gear and get the gear that's proven successful and get a fair contrast. So it's not just somebody quoting you the specs of what the manufacturer says about how it ought to work. It's somebody who's actually used the gear, had success with it, and can give you the tips that the manufacturers don't know about. So, so you can get them. Now, I will say this issue comes up in every training. People, they want to get their bees into poly. Because of what we talk about. Now, I want to contradict myself. It's not really contradicting. I want to present an alternate perspective on that. One of the factors I don't really talk about bee health in this training is the importance of propolis. Now, propolis is like the tree sap that bees collect, and they spread it all around the inside of the colony, and it actually helps them stay healthy. And the bee guys call it a propolis envelope. It coat everything on the inside of it. In fact, some people intentionally rough up the inside of their hives so that the bees will distribute more propolis. I don't know if it works or not. I don't know that it doesn't. It might. In natural hives, the whole inside of that tree cavity is coated with propolis. If you switch now to poly, you're putting them in a sterile environment right when they need to stay healthy. And so I actually discourage people from doing that now. You'd be better off keeping them in wood and building an insulation, having an external insulation strategy. So remember, I'm talking about the importance of insulation, but there are many people that successfully overwinter putting insulation on the outside of their wooden boxes. So mainly when you hear me complain about wood, it's because it's terrible in winter. If it's terrible if you don't supplement it. So you can do the same thing. You can build an external structure that fits around your hive out of foam insulation. You can hold it together with duct tape. Duct tape works fine. I've done it. I've gotten one colony through in wood, and I built because that was all I had and they were freebies, and I thought, what the heck, why not? And I built an external foam insulation, and I just held it together with duct tape and made it put twice as much. You want to insulate twice as much on top, just like in your own house. Heat rises. That's where you want to keep it from escaping. And they made it through. So I would be more inclined this late in the season to keep them in wood gear and insulate the outside. Tawny is saying something interesting, and I have heard other people talk about this. If you put follower boards on the outside, if you replace the two outside frames with follower boards, you have added a lot of R value to those two walls. And if you then also put insulation around the outside of it, you're doing a pretty good job. So it's not as good. It's not as good, but and that's what I'm about to address now. Should they only be insulated in winter? And before you answer the question, think about everything they need heat to use and need heat for. They raising brood, making wax, distributing propolis, and yes, reducing nectar to honey. Warm air holds more moisture than cold air. And so the warmer they can keep the hive, the faster they can reduce the honey. So I would argue that they need this insulation all year long. I'd also say that you have to look at a natural tree cavity. Now, those are, they have basically unlimited insulation above and below. And they often have walls that are at least 2 to 4 inches thick on the sides. So a natural cavity that they choose is insulated year round, naturally like that. So if you have wood gear, I would encourage you to insulate now. There's some people make noise and say just ridiculous things like, no, it's proven that you don't have to add insulation until after the first frost, and it's just nonsense. The bees don't suddenly need to stay warmer once it drops below frost temperature. They're a tropical insect. They're trying to keep the inside of that brood nest 92 degrees. Why would you wait until it got really cold to help them do that? Especially when the wooden hive is an unnatural environment. It doesn't really compare to a tree colony, a tree cavity, because it has less insulation than a tree cavity. So anyway, I would encourage you to get that on there now. Whatever strategy you use, try to make it so that you can get into the hive from the top in the winter. That's important. If they, you might need to add winter sugar, which is what we'll talk about later. Lisa points out that we had a long, cold spring. It never got warm in Homer, and so the idea of matching insulation to the calendar doesn't fit. I can also tell you, and this is just an aside, my overwinter colonies rocked it this summer. Even though it was a crappy summer, they rocked it. The packages struggled and struggled and struggled. So when you get sustainable, when you get these powerful overwintered colonies, you get more honey, you get bigger buildup, you make stronger splits. Everything is better with overwintered colonies. And again, yeah, I kind of, not to beat this dead horse, but if you think about how many bees it takes to heat a hive, and I'm not about to tell you how many that is, but we know that more bees have to spend more time heating when there's less insulation. That's just logic. When you don't have to dedicate as many bees to keep the hive warm, then you have more bees to do the other chores like raise the brood, expand the brood nest, raise the brood. They draw comb faster because it's warmer. They collect and distribute more propolis, which means they're sealing everything up very efficiently, and they create more honey. There's one study I saw that showed that a single queen hive in a poly box produced more honey than a double queen hive in a wooden box, in wooden gear. So everything gets more efficient. There's only one disadvantage, and that's cost for permanent insulation. And really what I mean by that is foam insulation is pretty free, but poly boxes can be expensive. They just can. And but you know what's expensive? Packages. And so the cost of poly gear is not as much as the cost of replacing packages. So that's the only real way to compare it. But that said, some people spend, 30 or 40 bucks on enough foam insulation to effectively insulate their wooden box, and they get them through. So I don't want to poo-poo that idea. That is if you're on a limited budget, and especially this late in the season, then the external insulation is a good way to go. Fall feeding strategy. So what I know from my temperature sensors is that the winter bees have all emerged by mid-October. So if we work backwards, that means that those bees were eggs in mid-September. And that means that the bees that were eggs in August raised the last round of winter bees that we hope was the strongest. So we want our colonies to be the heaviest, or to be the healthiest, in August and September. And we want them to be populous too. A big population is an important part of a healthy colony. So we want to encourage brood rearing into September. That's the main thing I'm getting at here. Now, we can do that by how we feed and when we feed. So in August, do I have this on? Sorry, I'm going to sneak peek ahead. Yeah. So we don't want you to add an extra box. We want them primarily storing syrup on the outside frames, and in that nice, they put that arc of syrup above the brood nest. We want frames that look like that in August. In late August and September, we want them to start backfilling that brood nest. The thing we hate in the summer when they're backfilling the brood nest, because then they'll get crowded and they'll swarm. Your bees are not going to swarm now. We are past the swarm season. Once we're in late August, September, we want them to backfill the brood nest, and all told, 50 to 70 pounds of weight is pretty good if you're in an insulated colony or insulated hive, more if you don't. We also want to end our feeding by mid-September so that all of the syrup is capped before October. Now, it's not because it's October. What we're really getting at is it's more difficult for them to cap it when it's colder, and their population is shrinking, so they have fewer workers they can dedicate to it. And when it's capped, honey or syrup is hygroscopic, which means it absorbs moisture. And that's important in the winter because there's going to be a lot of moisture in the colony, and as there should be. So let's go through this a little bit. Start fall feeding on time. Now, when I wrote this, it was in July, and now the flow is over everywhere. I can't imagine there's an actual flow anywhere left. Now, that doesn't mean there's not some nectar out there, but what it means is not enough for them to store surplus. They have a lot of brood this time of year. And when bees sense a lack of resources, then the queens will slow down and sometimes completely stop. They sense that as a dearth, a lack of resources. You don't want your queens slowing down right now. You want to encourage them to keep rearing brood. So there's two ways you can do that. One is to feed them 1-to-1 syrup right away and get your honey off on time so that you can feed. You can't feed syrup while you have your honey supers on. Harvest your honey. Don't get greedy. Don't try to save that extra pound. You can starve your bees. Every year, someone shows a picture of lots of dead bees in the bottom of the hive in August, and they say, "What happened?" And the answer is always, they starved. Then somebody will say, "But I saw flowers." Flowers require heat and proper humidity to produce sufficient nectar. We just don't have either of those now, and our flowers aren't wired to continue providing. Now, I think there's some of our exotics that are taken over, and like bird vetch, I suspect probably still has some, and the clover might still have some, because they're really adapted for different climates and they're just kind of up here, but not enough. It's not enough. And the fireweed is very fickle. And some places have great fireweed this year. A lot of people have really sickly fireweed. The bottom line is you go out and walk through a field of it. If you don't see your bees on it, it doesn't have any nectar. So I would encourage everybody to get their honey harvested right away and start feeding and give them a pollen patty. So we want that queen to keep laying. We want that population as strong as possible so that they'll raise as many winter bees as possible. Now, I addressed this a little bit before. Do not add an extra box for winter stores. You know, don't get the idea that there's a brood box and then a food box. The brood box will have all the food they need. So what happens, just in case you're curious, if to people who do that, they're adding extra space that the bees have to heat, so that's rough on them. And what usually happens is the bees will fill that darn thing and then they'll die in the winter, and then you'll have a whole super full of sugar syrup and you won't be able to do a thing with it. You'll have to extract it just to be able to use the frames again. I've been in that situation with dead outs. So they'll store all the food they need in their existing space, which is however many boxes they're in after you condense, if they needed to be condensed. Again, not all of them do, but if they do, you need to do it. And again, I kind of just hit this again and again and again. Extra space makes it harder for them to manage heat and humidity. It's really hard. You want it to be easy for them to do that. Here's the general rule of thumb. Somewhere around the third week of August, it's a little later than that this year, it just is, switch from 1-to-1. We start with 1-to-1 because that encourages brood rearing, and actually a little less than 1-to-1. I make it by the 5-gallon bucket. I will put 3 gallons of water and 2.5 gallons of sugar in it, a little thinner than 1-to-1. And that's not because I've experimented and done all these studies on it. It's because I've read studies where they did different feeding strategies, and less than 1-to-1, a little bit less than 1-to-1 seems to be ideal for brood rearing. By the time you get to the end of August, you're going to be switching to 2-to-1 syrup. Now, the reason we do that is because the bees don't have to work as hard to reduce it to 18% moisture and cap it, and you want them to have a lot of food stored for winter. You also want to stop giving them pollen patties in late August. I'm probably going to give mine one more round of pollen patties next week, and then I'll be done. So think of this as the end of the third week of August. And the ish is very important. It's a little different every year. Now, the reason why you want to stop giving them pollen patties is it's the lack of pollen, among other things. I should say the lack of pollen is one of the things that stimulates them into starting to raise winter bees. Because you want a whole box full of long-lived winter bees. And so if you keep feeding them pollen patties, you're giving them the food source that's going to delay some of that instinct to start raising winter bees. I like to be completely done with my feeding by early to mid-September. That way I know it's all capped. Yes, Jeff, 2-to-1 is 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. I should add, if you go on beekeeping forums, they'll always argue whether it's weight or volume. And what I'm here to tell you is the bees don't care. Don't get into that argument. Do whatever's easy. If you like measuring stuff out by weight, do it. I like to measure by volume because I can use the same container. I can take a gallon pitcher. I can get 3 gallons of water, hot water, pour it in my bucket. And then I can dry it out. I can put 2.5 gallons of sugar in it, or 6 gallons if I'm doing 2-to-1, although then I can't make it that much. I have to go back to 2 gallons in the bucket if I'm going to make 2-to-1 because I'm adding so much more sugar. But I can just use one container. And so I like that better. I will say this, if you're going to heat it, don't ever boil it. You can change the chemical composition of sugar by boiling it. when it's in the water. You can boil the water, but take it off the heat when you do the mixing. All right, so complete the feeding by early to mid-September. Now, you want to stop feeding. People always ask this question, and it's a great question. When do you stop feeding? Well, often they'll just stop taking it because they don't have enough room to put it anywhere. When they fill that thing up, they'll stop taking it. The other is when they're heavy enough. And that is a question that's hard for new beekeepers to grasp. What I would encourage you to do is go out there and tilt your colony forward, backward, sideways. It doesn't matter. Just lift up one edge and feel how heavy it is. You should start doing that every week. And if it feels light, you need to increase your feeding. By the time you're done in September, it should be a chore to tilt back. It should be a chore. So tilt it now, get a feel for it. It'll give you some perspective on how heavy it is and how much weight they've gained. I will say this, that sometimes if the colony is sick, they'll also stop taking the syrup. But that's why if you've done your prep work before, then you'll know that your colony is healthy. And I'm just about to talk about oxalic acid, but first my disclaimer. I don't like treating bees. I don't want to treat my bees. I don't like it. It goes against nature, in my opinion. In a perfect world, we would just let the bees alone and they would have to learn. I mean, not individually, but the strong colonies, the one that had some resistance, would survive. And then the strong colonies would breed with other strong colonies. And you'd end up with a population of bees that managed Varroa on their own. That is an ideal situation. That is, in fact, what happened in many areas of the world that don't have the money to do all these treatments that we do, like Africa, Mexico, I've heard. I haven't been down there. These are things I've heard. And they have bees that have much more natural resistance than ours do. So, but here's the problem with that. And that is how I started, by the way. I wanted to be treatment-free. Only 1 to 2% of colonies have any mite-resistant qualities at all. And to propagate these colonies, you have to have thousands of them and years of selective breeding. Randy Oliver's a beekeeper in California, Central California. He has thousands of colonies. He started doing an intensive management strategy to try to graft off of his queens that had good mite resistance. It took him 5, and he had colonies that he said laughed at Varroa. They just laughed at Varroa. They just didn't get them. They managed them just great on their own. Then he would graft off those queens, and the daughter queens colonies didn't have the same traits. Those colonies succumbed to Varroa. And it took him 5 years of intensive breeding before those characteristics started being inherited by the daughter queens. That's just not going to happen in Alaska. All of our bees come from California. And to be precise, they come from California almond pollinators. And so when they're selecting queens for their breeding programs, they want queens that build up fast so that they can make packages to send to us. And they want bees that pollinate almonds well. That's what they do. They don't care about overwintering characteristics or qualities. They don't care about mite resistance. What they want is pollination and fast buildup. So, and if you're an average backyard beekeeper, you'd have to have 100 different packages before you had a chance at getting one that was resistant, and then your traits would be lost as soon as they need to be requeened. So I have tried to get Varroa resistant queens shipped here. They won't do it. I think I'm going to make a trip this winter and go out and try to talk some of them into doing a project with me. The bottom line is we're in a genetic bottleneck here. All of our bees come from California. None of them have the traits we want. And so if we had feral colonies that went out and lived over the winter and somehow in a tree cavities, which we don't, all our feral colonies die over the winter, all our swarms die that aren't caught. Then we could maybe capture swarms from resistant colonies and build from that. We don't have any of that. So since we don't have that, I truly believe that's the long-term answer, but we can't do it here. So in the meantime, I'm picking the least damaging alternative, and that's oxalic acid. It's not a synthesized chemical, it's plant-based. It doesn't persist in wax or honey, and the vapor treatment does not harm brood. Now, you can do an oxalic acid drip that does harm brood, but I don't do that, and I don't want to tell people to do it. So it doesn't hurt the wax, it doesn't hurt the honey. If you use one of these synthesized chemicals, you have to always mark your frames. You can never have honey in those frames, or not ethically. And I don't think you can ethically sell a frame that's been exposed to that, although it happens, because it does persist in the wax. And there are cases where it builds up so much that it can be toxic to the colony. Oxalic acid, we don't really know how it works. I can describe how it works. You heat it with a device until it vaporizes. The vapor drifts through the hive and crystallizes on the surfaces. And for whatever reason, it kills mites. We don't know why it kills the mites. It doesn't kill the bees. It doesn't kill the brood. It kills the mites. We don't know why. So, but during the time it's in a vapor form, it's dangerous to people. Only then. So it's not to be taken lightly. You need to have a quality respirator, glasses and gloves for those several minutes. Once it's crystallized, you can't hurt yourself by touching it. You can't breathe it because it's crystallized. It doesn't present a health hazard to you. You don't have to worry about handling the frames or the bees going forward. None of that lasts. So, but I just want to encourage, don't just buy a wand off of the internet and put oxalic acid in and expect that you're going to do it. Now, here's the main thing. I do it in mid-October after all the winter brood has emerged, because varroa mites reproduce underneath the cap as the larvae, when it's a pupa. Right after it's capped, the brood spins a little, the larvae spins a little cocoon and it pupates, turns into an adult. That's when the mites are reproducing in those cells. If they're under that cap, oxalic acid will not reach them and won't affect them. So in the summertime, 80% of the mites are under the caps. When there's no capped brood, which is after mid-October, you can get a 90% kill. You can also do it during a brood break if you requeen. You can also do swarms 8 days after the queen starts laying, or 7 days, because then none of the brood is capped. And you can do packages. When I started doing packages is when my overwintering rate skyrocketed. And now I do it twice a year. So Apiguard, in my opinion, Apiguard is evil. So the manufacturer will tell you that it doesn't persist in comb and honey. That's only technically true. What they don't tell you is that the byproducts that it breaks down into do persist in comb and honey and can rise to toxic levels in the wax. So I think Apiguard is evil. And the people that use it, the big bee producers down south, they also cycle out their wax. They cycle out their frames every few years because of the buildup. Now, you know how they cycle them out? They put them in nukes and sell them to people. I don't get that. They give you their bad comb. So yeah, I don't get the ethical aspect of that whole thing. But here's the thing. We're in Alaska. We have a shorter season. Mites can't reproduce as long. The shorter brood season means a shorter mite reproduction season. We don't need Apiguard. We don't need it. We can get by just on oxalic acid, maybe during a brood break and at the end of the year. I can tell you my colonies look great. They're solid and they're strong. And I haven't zapped them since last fall and since last October, and I'll do it again now. Now, here's the thing. There's a question about you might have to do it earlier than October. It won't help you. Right now, 80% of the mites are under the cappings. So you can treat, but you're not going to effectively kill mites. You're not going to put a dent in them. Also, Apiguard does kill mites under the cap, but it also kills brood. And remember, our brood season is short. We cannot afford a 2-week brood break now. Your colony will not recover before winter. They just won't. So these guys, that's one of the other things about it, is that they have time to recover from the brood break that is caused by Apiguard. It's not always happen, but it's often, it's frequent. They have time to recover from it. We don't. So I just don't think we need it. Now, I am going to be doing some of this year. I don't really want to be doing this. I know it sounds funny, but I'll just say that if you're interested in me coming out and helping with your hive, a treatment this fall in October, then you can message me and we can talk about it. I'll do it for some minimal fee, and it'll be a discount for multiple hives, because once I'm there, I'm there. I'm not going to charge a lot of money for it. I try to not make money. This is going to sound funny, but I try to not make money beekeeping, because I don't want people to think that I'm saying what I'm saying because I'm trying to make money. I would way rather educate people about how this works and have groups of people working together to buy the equipment and then treat each other's hives, kind of a collective in that regard, because it is very expensive to do. Or I'd rather have somebody decide to do this for a living that used adequate protection and practices and charged a reasonable amount and went around and did things for people. But this is kind of a new idea. I'm just starting these classes, and so I'm willing to do it this year if you're interested. But again, just message me. This is not a sell. I would really rather not do it, but I will do it until we get this other stuff established. That's actually the end of the presentation. And so now is any questions, and I know we're only scheduled till 8. I will stay on and answer any questions that people have for a reasonable amount of time. 15 or 20 minutes is, I think, what it was last time. And you could drop off any time if you don't want to stay. So the floor is open. Feel free to unmute and put the camera on and ask a question if you got one.
I have a question, Lisa.
Okay. Hey, Lisa.
I'm confused about the screen bottom board. Are you all winter? Do you have an open screen to the elements, sort of like the North of 60 guys does?
So yes and no. So here's what I do. I absolutely use a screen bottom board. I think they're very important, but I use a screen bottom board over a solid sheet of plywood. So ventilation is a myth. Bees don't need more ventilation. When we use the term ventilation, it is important to the hive, but humans tend to think about an HVAC system and all these motors running and all this access. No. The bees manage it all. They manage it all with an opening only a couple inches wide. They do not need more ventilation than that. But the screen bottom board does 2 important functions for me. First is it lets me do an oxalic acid treatment from below the bottom board. I can't help anybody who has a solid bottom board, because I'm not going to stick that 300 and some degree wand into a colony with flammable wax and I don't know, some other debris that can catch fire. I won't do that. But with a screen bottom board, I can put the wand underneath the bottom board. The vapor drifts right up through it and treats the colony. So that's the first reason I use it.
You have a removable plywood under it, so it's like
nope.
You take
nope. Okay. I keep it closed off to the elements. I like that air gap, and this is the second one. My screen bottom board essentially gives me an air gap between the bottom of the hive and the top of my hive stand, which is solid plywood. And what that air gap does is, in the winter, when it's too cold for the undertaker bees to do their job, they can't haul out the dead. Those dead bees accumulate. And on a solid bottom board, once you get into the freeze thaw of spring, they turn into the greatest mess you've ever imagined. On On a screen bottom board, it kind of dehydrates them. That air gap below them kind of dehydrates them. So they're way easier to clean up, both for the bees and me when I get in there and finish the job in April. First time I lift it off the bottom board and scrape it off. So no, they do not need ventilation. Don't give it to them. It only hurts them. Put that, if you've got a screen bottom board, that's great, but put it over a solid surface. If you have a screen bottom board and a hive type that has like a slot for a piece of coroplast, a piece of plastic cardboard, keep that in. You don't want any access to extra ventilation coming in from under the hive.
Yeah, mine has a pull-out polystyrene little tray.
Just leave
So
it
you
in
keep that-
there all the time. And
Okay.
you just pull that out to do the treatment. Yes.
Right, okay. In the summer, if that's out for a while, it might not matter as much, who knows, or maybe it does.
No, so here's what I would say to you. If it actually ever got 90 plus degrees in the summer, I would agree with you. But for the most part, the bees in Alaska are constantly heating. They never stop heating. So why would you make it harder on them to heat?
Right, okay. Okay, that was my question. I was
Okay.
confused.
Any other questions?
So I have a few questions. So my first question was about what's the best method to use for a varroamite, just to check your varroamite count.
Right. So what the research or what the main message of the industry is to do a mite wash.
Right.
But I disagree. But don't have tons of experience in this, so you need to take this with a grain of salt. But here's my thinking. A sample of 300 bees out of 30,000 or more is not a good sample.
Right.
And there's also some recent research that shows that most of the mites are not on the nurse bees like we thought before, but they're actually on the drones on the outside frames. So here's what I do. I'm going to go in next week, probably. I have all my supers off, and I'll probably zap all of them with oxalic acid, and I will count the 24-hour drop. Now, here's why I think that's an effective way to just test. 80% of the mites are underneath the cappings now. I mean, it's one of those just understood things, so it might be wrong, but it's the way it's trained, that 80% of the mites are underneath the cappings right now reproducing. Well, that means that only 20% of the mites are available to be killed. Well, I can multiply by 5. If I get 400 mites drop, I can multiply 400 by 5 and get a feel for how many mites are there. If I get 60, I can multiply 60 by 5. So to me, I can sample the entire hive at once or a random 1%. So I would argue that and I'm not hurting them. I'm not going to slow down brood. I don't have to worry about any of that. I don't even have to open up the hive to do it. So I would argue that the best way, and I'm not the only one saying this, there's a website out there that's really cool. It lets you say what the mite count was and what your hive population was. And it does have some secret sauce calculator that's probably just multiplying it by 5, but it'll tell you what your mite population is. And I could maybe post that on the Facebook page. It's actually, I think it's mitecalculator.com, something like that. It's just something somebody put together. They're not trying to sell you anything. That's the advantage. It's just sort of applying this principle that why do a sample on 1% or less of your bees when the recent research shows that the mites are unevenly distributed. And so you can't expect a reliable sample.
Okay. My next question was again regarding the screen bottom boards. So I actually have 3 hives. I have one wood hive that has a screen bottom board. I have a superior hive that has a screen bottom board with the that little corrugated plastic thing that slides in and out. And then I have the cheaper polystyrene hive that does not have any type of thing to slide in and out. My hive stand is basically
It has a
solid
screen
plywood.
bottom board, but nothing that slides in and out is what you're saying.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
So I have a solid plywood hive stand.
Hive stand.
So they're all on the hive stand with the plywood, but the polystyrene hives, the bottom board has kind of a arches on the bottom as so for
Scallops
airflow, I'm
in the
guessing.
bottom.
Yes, gallows. Okay.
Yeah.
And so do I want to block those for the winter, or what's the
Go
best
ahead, Matt.
option?
Yeah, I've had those same ones, and what I do is I will go over to Lowe's or Home Depot and get a yardstick over at the paint section, and I will put one on each side to cover up those arches.
Okay.
It gives you a chance to basically lock in a volume of air underneath your colony, and really the big thing is to keep a wind from coming through and sweeping that and taking heat out over and over and over again.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Okay. Now, I'm up in Fairbanks. Okay, so it's a bit colder here than it's down there, and so I follow Etienne a lot. One of the things that he talked about on one of his videos was pushing the hives close together with foam board between to give insulation between the hives. So you're basically sharing a lot of insulation. Plus, he also says he tries to get up to an R45 on the top of his hives.
Yes. Yes.
So I'm trying to mimic that this year. This is my 3rd year. Hopefully I'll have some success this year. What are your thoughts on those? I mean, pushing the hives together.
I mean, my thoughts on Etienne in general is that he's a genius. And a lot of what I do is based on what he's done. So first, have you seen my videos on making a candy board insert?
Yes, I have, and I've actually did that last year, and I'm going to try something a little bit different this year. Follow that with some other things out of my own brain.
Okay, well, and that's exactly what you should be doing. I would encourage you. I would just say that I think that's the one thing that I do that's better than what Etienne does, because he still has like wood down there. And if you just make it out of foam, it's super easy to clean. It's super easy to manage. It just fits in place. You don't have extra gear.
Right.
So it's the same principle, the different components. Now, and I also love the gap to be able to look in, and the plexiglass strip that lets you look down there and see that
like
they're
that
okay. So his approach and mine would be the same in terms of upper insulation. If you just put yet another piece inside the hive, because that's what our approaches have the same. We're putting all that insulation inside a hive body on the top. Right. So that's the important thing. And I watched him removing his insulation this year, and he was just working at it. I was like, oh, there's an easier way, Etienne. Just strip leave a strip of duct tape and just slide it up.
Exactly.
So
now,
anyway, you should do that exact thing. Now, what I'll be doing, what he does, I think he did this a little different last year. I don't think he put insulation between the hives. I think he wrapped them with Reflectix and then Tyvek taped the top seam so he couldn't get out the top. So he pushed them together, yes, but I don't think he had insulation between them. Now I could be wrong about that. But I have done it both ways. All those ways. I pushed them together. I've left them separate. I have had extra cozies, foam cozies on the outside of the poly box. and I think I was overkilling it for Anchorage's climate. Now what I do is I build a 3-sided cozy for the outside so that it never, the north wind, it's most protected from the north wind, which is the big storms we get in the wintertime here. I think, and what I can't remember is what Etienne did. If he only, I know he had extra insulation behind, and I know he had extra insulation on the sides. I don't know if he had extra insulation all around the front. I kind of think he did, and then he removed it once it got warm in April.
Yeah, I'm going to double check the videos I watched, but I do believe he did have some in the front as well.
Here's what I know. I know for a fact you cannot over insulate it. You cannot over insulate it. You can become obsessive and lose your family because all you're ever doing is spending time insulating your bees. But from the bees' perspective, you cannot possibly over insulate it because they won't get too hot. It's impossible for them to get too hot. They'll just stop making heat when it gets to the right temperature and then wait for it to drop a little bit below what they need before they start again. But you cannot hurt them with too much insulation. Now, there's one exception to that, and that's spring. And I've talked to Etienne about this, and we're brainstorming ways to deal with it. In a cold spring, there's only one downside to polyhives, and that's that in the spring, that if imagine that you have, I'll just make this simple, it's not box dimensions. Imagine you have a box that's 10 inches high, and in the fall, you have an 8-inch deep cluster. And by spring, it's only 6 inches from the top. So there's a bigger gap below. Well, that can get really cold down there. And for the bees to get out and do cleansing flights, they have to go through, they have to navigate that really cold area before they can come out and do a cleansing flight. And so Etienne that's one reason why Etienne condenses. He's trying to reduce the space below the cluster that they would use to access the exit, both during the winter, just to fly out and die. Lots of bees do that. If you have bees fly out and die in the winter, by the way, don't think of it as a failure. That's just what they do. All this nonsense about how the snow confuses them and they think it's the sun and blah. Give me a break. There wouldn't be a bee alive. If you think about the evolutionary process of bees, the confusing sunshine with snow, there would be no bees. They would all be extinct long ago. You know, what happens? Stand out there and watch them. They fly out, they do fine until they get cold, and then they drop on the snow and they buzz around until they die. So anyway, so you want to try to prevent the cold sink. And so that's why Etienne removes the front insulation once it starts warming up. But I think I'm actually going to drill a hole in there and clog it up with like a wine cork or something, so that in March I can give them an entrance that's higher up, that's closer to the bottom of the cluster. So that's the dynamic. I think we need to play with different results. Karen Thurlow is a beekeeper from Maine and now from New Brunswick, and I did an interview of her. What she does is she has an upper entrance that she keeps sealed until March. And then she just unseals it in March for this exact reason. So you don't get that cold sink in the bottom. So as you toy with it, just think about that dynamic. Having an upper entrance all winter makes it much harder on them. They'll go through more fuel. They'll have to work harder, but it's helpful if they're still strong in March to let them not develop dysentery, because that's what happens with the cold sink. They can't get outside and they'll basically poop in the hive, and then the hive gets sick.
Yeah, that's what happened this year with mine. My next question, entrance reducers. We go to the smallest possible entrance as we can.
Here's what I did. Last winter, I did a winter shim, 2-inch shim, and it had an opening in the top. It was about 1.5 inches wide, 3/8 of an inch deep. And I put that under the bottom box. Once I pulled the honey, I lifted the box up, put that winter shim down, put the box on it. So I created a gap above, and I got I got the shim and the opening on top so that no matter how many dead bees pile up, they still have that entrance.
Okay.
That was awesome. That worked great. I wasn't out there trying to clean, and I shut the bottom entrance. I think I left an inch, but I think this year I'll probably leave an inch still. That you want to reduce it to almost nothing, an
Okay.
inch maybe.
And this shim that you made, do you make a styrofoam shim or wood
No,
shim?
I just made it out of old, like Matt found somebody that had a bunch of deep boxes last year, deep wooden
Okay.
boxes. And I cut some out of the deep wooden boxes, and I cut some out of, I had an extra 10 by 2 by 10, and I just made a box out of it, and then I cut it into 2-inch sections and used my table saw to put a little opening in it.
It's not really going to make much difference since that's going to be the coldest part of the stack.
Right.
So it can be wood or it can be foam.
Okay.
Yeah,
And another thing that Etienne said was that the condensation happens on the coldest part of the box.
correct.
So and you don't want that to be the top, of course, because
Right,
then of course it'll condense up there, melt, drip down on your cluster. Is it better to have the backside, sides, or bottom? What's the best
doesn't matter.
location, as long as it's not the top?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Because anywhere on the side, it's going to drip.
Yes, I'll just
And
run
they
down to the
utilize,
bottom.
they need that moisture.
Yes.
They need it because honey only has 18% moisture. And so they need that to process the honey in the winter. So, but
Right.
you don't want it to drip on them. So extra insulation above is helping prevent that from happening.
Right.
And taping the seams helps that too. So,
okay. Last question I have, the brood minder. Is there an affordable option?
no.
Well,
There's
that's not true because as we were talking about the other night, they will have Black Friday sales on brood minders. So
Okay.
watch for that. It won't help you this winter, but
Right.
next week it could help you.
Well, it depends though, right? Like when I think affordable, maybe I'm just more of a cheapskate than Matt. But
I'm pretty
where
tight.
can I get one for $10?
Yeah.
I don't think you're going to get one for $10. You might
even
be
if
able to
it's
get
less
one
than
for
100.
25 or 30 on sale. But
Okay.
what I can tell you is it's worth it. I
Yeah.
just bought 10 more. And because I
Okay.
bought 10 more, and this is where I think clubs ought to get together with our buying power, because when I bought 10, they were 37 each. If I bought 100, I think there'd be like 35 each. So you do get some, savings, but I can tell you that, just knowing when my hives are dead out is so valuable to go clean them out before they get so gross and
Right.
moldy. And I don't know how you are, but I just love knowing my bees are doing okay.
I become obsessed.
Yeah. So I, there's also no cheap Broadway plays, but if you get a chance to go to one, you're
right.
Yeah. So it's kind of I'm spending money and I'm not really expecting it to be a good buy, but I get great value for it, I would say.
Right.
But is there a Fairbanks Bee group per se?
I have not been able to find anybody as a group in this area. There's individuals that have Facebook pages, but
I know
as far as a
Lisa,
bee group,
Lisa does.
Yeah.
So you might be able to get a group of people to go in together, but then you have to manage it and collect money.
Exactly.
Although I bet you anything that if you bought it, you'd be able to sell them at that and recover your price.
I'm just a bit of an introvert and I don't want to deal with people.
Well, that may be, but I will tell you, I think that the best thing about a brood minder is if you make changes to your winter setups and you can see a temperature differential, either good or bad, then you can say, that's what I've got this year. This is when it succeeded when the others failed, or when it failed when the others were doing really well. And then you can take that off the board and say, I don't have to do that again. Or this is something I really want to pursue and it looks like it really has some promise.
Right.
If you add extra insulation, you watch that temperature go up. It's sitting right around 70, add the installation, goes up to 90. They're not rearing brood. They're like, what? And then it works its way back down to true, so it gives you good feedback on that. It also lets you see when they actually do go into cluster when it gets really cold, because their internal temperature will drop to around 50. So, but if you're or even the high 40s, but if your internal temperature is a high 40s and the external temperature is 0, you got a 40-degree differential, your colony's fine.
Right. Yeah. I mean, external temperature of 0 in Fairbanks is almost unheard of in the winter.
Awfully warm.
Yeah, that's flip-flop weather. Yeah, we're looking average temperature last winter was about -30. And from end of November through the end of January. My bees survived through until about mid-February, and that's when I had they were all gone. So what was I had another thing.
You'll learn a lot if it'll really inform your beekeeping, and wherever you post and what you post about what your bees are doing, it'll help all those people too. I mean, I know you're not doing it all for them, but it really does have it has a trickle down effect for everybody to know what's going on in there.
Well, the other thing that we didn't talk about is it takes work to do all the preparation for winter. It really does, and it's not something to be minimized. And getting 30, like for me, it's like I shoot for like 35 pounds that I'm adding of feed for each one of my colonies. That's really what I'm looking for, and that has a cost that's associated with it as well.
Of course.
And for people that don't want to do it, they say it's not worth it. It's like, well, it's worth it for me to take that extra time and spend a little bit more money and do that times, like 6 or 7. And that's easily, less than the cost of a new package of bees. And at that point, it's like, I'm way ahead. So yeah, I'm like the absolute cheapest. And, really trying to conserve a resource that I have that's proven, because like this year, I don't know what your bees were like, but the bee packages I had that came up, they were not very good.
Yeah, they struggled to get going.
Yeah, it took a long time.
So right now, I put this on the Facebook page. So my top boxes still have a lot of capped brood, and I'm wanting to condense everything down to a single box, but what to do with all that capped brood? I don't want to sacrifice the capped brood, because some of those frames have 20% capped brood and 80% capped honey. What's your suggestion there? Give it another week, another 10 days?
Well, the capped brood is all going to emerge in 11 days or less.
Right. Okay.
I'd
so
give it another 11 days. I mean,
okay.
12 or 13 even, and then
Yeah, it's just right now we're hitting our wet season. Temperatures are starting to drop down. There's not going to be much more opportunities for me to get into the hive to pull those frames.
But you can go in and put those frames in the bottom.
If I have room in the front, if I have room in the bottom.
Well, I think you said in the post that you think 16 to 18 frames of bees, something like that.
Yes. So I'd have to go through the bottom box.
But you don't have 16 to 18. You don't have 16 to 18. Sorry, I'll say that a different way. Those frames don't all have bees on them, or brood on them.
No, not all of those. No.
Right. So since you're going to feed them, you could pull a couple of resource frames.
Okay.
And just set them aside. And if they're honey, you can harvest it. If they're not honey, you can wait and then let the bees rob it out in another couple of weeks when that capped brood emerges. You have those choices, but you could do that. And I've done that too. And you have how many hives? 3?
Just 3, yeah.
3, yeah. So are they all like that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, good. Yeah, I would be inclined, if I needed to shrink them, that I would pull the resource frames, and you can always stick them somewhere and give it to them in the spring next year.
Okay. 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 Well, thank you very much.
So there's a question about fogging with essential oils. And what I'll say is that's not research based. There's anecdotal evidence, but there's really no research that works. So I'm not saying it doesn't, but I don't think you'll find any of the commercial beekeepers who rely on the effectiveness of treatment fogging with essential oils. I don't think you'll see any of that. And those guys do what works.
And I know somebody had a question before about something like Hive Alive and adding it to feed. And everything I've seen is when you do that, it's great for the people that make Hive Alive. It also will promote robbing. So I don't do that.
Right. Yeah.
That was the most polite way I could say it. Sorry.
I use 1 temperature sensor per box because I'm not Etienne Tardif. I want to know. I mean, I love what he does. I mean, and I love his mind. I love the way he puts it together. But if I know, I want to know if my hive's alive and if they have brood. And a single temperature sensor at the top gives me that information. So, and I'll let Etienne do the thing. The other thing, if you do get the brood minders, I learned from Etienne, you don't have to use that long strip that they come with. You can cut it off about 3 inches away from it, and then it doesn't get in the way. That's a problem I had last year. If you have that sticking out, I thought it was supposed to stick outside the box. That's how the pictures work. The bees have a really hard time sealing that up, that crack where it sticks out of the box. So you can cut it off so the whole thing stays inside the box. So. All right, any other questions?
Oh, time to make dinner.
People have been troopers. Matt, thanks for hanging around, and thanks everybody for dropping by and your participation. Again, you can ask your local bee club, ask questions on the site there, and you can I'll make sure you watch the if you haven't seen them, the videos on my YouTube channel about making a candy board insert that's super easy and cheap and very effective.
You know, we need to get one of those classes done for that in September, in person. You know, like we did before.
I think so, yeah.
Really do.
Yeah, I think that's what's going to happen in September. Nathan and I talked about it already.
Yeah.
So, all right. Thank you, everybody.
Yep. Good night.
Good night.